Okay, now we continue to read from verse 3. The next day, we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. From there, we put out to sea again and passed the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us, an omen of things to come. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship, so now they're going to get on another ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Sindus, where the wind did not allow us to hold our course. We sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Solomon. Anyway, we moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens. I would have stopped there. We have Fair Havens right up here off the coast of Lake Ontario, near the town of Lycia. Well, the interesting thing about this is that Luke is recording this. This is not a parable. This is a real story. This really happened. And Luke is giving dates. He's mentioning people's names. He's giving the exact course and all the places that they stopped. Probably between Luke and Paul, not like Billy Graham, he would fly millions of miles and travel all over. So they were familiar with this whole hopping in a boat and riding around the Mediterranean. These places were probably familiar because he'd been there before. And I can't help but think, as Paul was coming back after his third journey, that he sailed to the south of Cyprus. And at that time, I was just imagining him looking at that island of Cyprus, being able to see it and remembering that that's where it all began for Paul. If you remember, he left Antioch. Where was the first place he went to? It was Cyprus. They had connections there. And this is where his ministry of planting churches and preaching the gospel began. And now he's heading back towards Rome, and now he's going on the north side of Cyprus. And I have to imagine that, sitting there in a boat, nothing much to do, that it must have brought back these wonderful, reminiscent memories about all that God did. Isn't it good to think back and have good memories about, your life and how God has used you? I mean, it's an extra special blessing. So we continue. In verse 9, much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was the day after the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is in October. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, this would have been Fairhaven where they were, the majority decided that they would sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing the southwest and northwest. So 2 words pop out: dangerous and disastrous. That's pretty much the summary of this whole trip. Dangerous and disastrous. So, we got a picture of how big this boat was, how many people there were on it. And just as a little side note, you did not sail in the Mediterranean in November. Most people, how around here people have camps, and they go up to camp, and when is it? Well, Mark, no. When do you close down your camp? Okay, you don't really close it down, but most people go up there, sometime in the fall when things start freezing up, they close up the camp, and then they go up again in the spring, or, maybe like Memorial Weekend. They open it all up again. It was the same way with sailing in the Mediterranean. September comes along, you start putting your boat in mothballs, you put it up on the shore somewhere because you're not going anywhere. Now, they left in October, and they were making slow headway. And by the time they got to Fairhaven, I don't know how much time elapsed, they don't really say, but you're getting into a very dangerous time to sail. I think when we talk about Jesus and the apostle and the disciples in the boat, and I think that was a storm that the Lord generated himself because he wanted to teach those guys a lesson. This storm and this bad weather was just foolishness because it wasn't anything supernatural about it. It was just a bad time to sail. And Paul was basically just telling them that. So it was a dangerous time. And it was at this point where you have this little disagreement between Paul, who knows, what's happening. He'd been to sea before, and he knew exactly, what was going on. But it was the centurion, I guess that would have been Julius, and it was the captain of the ship and the owner of the ship. So we're assuming that these guys have a vested interest in getting to Rome as soon as possible. So they're the ones that make the decision to continue on. So we continue in verse 13. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind, this is where it gets really bad. A gentle south wind. Before long, a wind of hurricane force, called a nor'easter, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. And as we passed the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard. They passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syracuse. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, they finally gave up all hope. It's getting exciting, isn't it? I've only been actually sailing one time, and we rented this boat. Lynn and some friends of ours who actually, don't worry, I don't know how to sail, but they let me drive the boat once. And we were on the Chesapeake Bay for 5 days, I think. And it was so flat as a pancake that we could barely use the sail if we had to motor. So I'm thinking, my experience on the water is nothing like this. I've always enjoyed peaceful boating, having peaceful boating experiences, but this is just terrible enough to know that if I'm in a little boat, and my boat is, even if it's 130 feet long, but the Mediterranean can generate waves that are 12, 15 feet high, and a boat that size is just not a safe place to be. And this is what they were experiencing now. The term driven along means that they were helpless. They were in a helpless situation. Now, this boat had a sail. It wasn't like the boat that I sailed in where you could actually sail into the wind because of, technology and all that. But this boat had a big square sail. They didn't even have a rudder. They had these big oars that they would try to steer it with. And in terms of power, they didn't have 100 guys down there with oars. It wasn't one of those kind of boats. It was totally dependent on the wind. So when it says driven along, it means driven along. They were in a totally helpless situation. And now we can see that they're conceding that because they're starting to throw, they pulled a lifeboat in because they must have been pulling that behind them. And they figured that's going to get, the rope will break. So they pull that on board and they start throwing off anything that they didn't need anymore because they're waking up to the fact that they are in big trouble. The term, the gentle south wind, isn't that kind of deceiving? I know I've gone on outings before and the sky is bright and sunny and, with just a matter of a few minutes, it can change drastically, especially in Syracuse. So they had this calm, I guess you could call it the calm before the storm, but that's what enticed them to head off. Oh, look, it's beautiful weather. And, I think Paul saw through that And yet they decided to continue on. And once they did, there was literally no going back. They didn't have that kind of control over that ship. So things are getting really bad. And guess what? They get even worse. Verse 21, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken, I told you so. You should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because now this is where it gets really interesting. Not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God whom I serve and I belong to, in whom I serve, stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. Okay, you guys aren't going to die. The ship isn't going to be in such great shape after all this, but, they come to this point. And, I think every once in a while you need an angel to show up. That happens in Scripture. Now, Paul was a man of prayer. And you get the sense that he knew that they were heading to danger. And he had that promise within him, but it probably was very helpful to him to have that angel show up and just encourage him. It must have been a lot like with Joseph and Mary entered